Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Composing Success, Smith+Nephew's Agile Digital Transformation in Med Device Manufacturing. My name is Natalia, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. In this webinar, you'll get a first-hand look at how Smith+Nephew, a global leader in medical device manufacturing innovation, leveraged composable technology to drive significant operational impact and elevate quality, all while navigating a highly regulated environment. And now I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Sarath Krishnaswamy leads the charge in digital transformation at Smith+Nephew, bringing a wealth of experience in driving innovation and operational excellence within the medical device industry. He'll share firsthand insights into their journey, challenges, and success. And Eric Marindet is an accomplished leader with a diverse background in business, intelligence, and international affairs. He has 15 plus years experience in building and leading teams in operations and product development. And as Chief Business Officer at Tulip, Eric oversees all revenue, customer, and ecosystem development teams, focusing on expanding Tulip's market presence and enhancing customer impact. And so I'll pass this off now to Sarath and Eric.
Hey, thanks, Natalia. Sarath, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Looking forward to the discussion. Before we get into that, maybe I just give folks an overview on what we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to talk a little bit for attendees here. We're going to talk a little bit about Smith+Nephew specifically, learn a little bit about their operation. We kind of want to set the stage for the discussion today. Then we're going to talk about their approach to the strategy and implementation of taking a digital first approach to their operations, what that's looked like, how that's enabled certain things, and perhaps some challenges that they've encountered along the way. We're going to talk about how they, it's been a long journey. We're going to talk about how they drove adoption, how they got trust and buy-in and built momentum along the way. And then, Sarath, I'm excited to hear your reflections as a practitioner, someone out in the field leading these efforts. I'm eager to hear the lessons learned and any advice you have for our attendees and for me personally as well. I'm excited to hear that perspective. So without further ado, let's hop into it. I want to hear, Sarath, if you could maybe give us a background, if you could tell us a little bit about your personal background, and then if you could give us for those who aren't familiar with Smith+Nephew's operations, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Smith+Nephew as a company and the nature of product that you're building and how those products are built.
Sure. Personally, for about 30 years now, I've been a leader in generally R&D in the med device adjacent industries, be it at startups or at larger companies. This is really my first gig in operations, other than a stint leading advanced robotics at Amazon, which was sort of in between. I've been with Smith+Nephew 6 years now, really originally brought on to lead a center of excellence for robotics, automation, vision, which is, those are technologies that are generally most of my background. And that really quickly pivoted to digitization and kind of more manufacturing 4.0 sorts of applications. The pandemic had a bit to do with that, and really just understanding that as we were deploying what I call hardline automation and robotics and vision, we really didn't have the data underneath to support why we were doing what we were doing. And so there was a lot of, like many med device companies, we're I'd say behind the other industries in terms of implementing digital solutions. And so it's really been a learning curve for me and a learning curve for the company as well. The company Smith+Nephew is a diversified MedTech company. We're probably originally thought of as a British company that made wound dressings. If you've heard of Elastoplast in the old days, things like that. It was formed by a gentleman named Smith and his nephew in the United Kingdom. Surprise, surprise. Right now, as of now, the company has 3 principal business units. The original wound business unit is still in place. That makes slightly more complicated wound dressings than elastoplasts now, really specialty wound dressings for complex injuries, burns, negative pressure systems, things like that. We have another business unit, which is orthopedics, which is hips, knees, robotics for orthopedic surgery. And then a third division, which is sports medicine, which is looking at things like ACL repair, joint repair, things like that. What else can I tell you? We have a number of factories across the world for each of those business units, and my team's responsibility is really operational technology across that suite of factories.
Yeah, and how many factories does Smith+Nephew operate, and in what markets are these factories located?
Depending on how you count, 12 to 16. We have factories for each of the business units, and generally spread worldwide. So we have a number in we have a principal campus in Memphis for our orthopedics organization in the United States, and then orthopedics locations in Europe and in Malaysia. We have our sports medicine organization has factories in the United States and in Costa Rica, and our wound business unit has the original location in the United Kingdom, plus locations in Suzhou, China, and in the United States.
So global production, global distribution of these products. I'm sure that there's been no complications associated with any of the tariffs. I'm sure that that's just been super smooth sailing. It hasn't probably created any disruption whatsoever for your business.
Yeah, I just got an update about the tariffs 20 minutes ago, and it's as painful as you might expect.
Well, I think
everything's changing every moment. We indeed, it actually creates pressure, I think, on our organization, because we've teased out that maybe some of the data that we're gathering might be really helpful in making these decisions in a timely fashion. So
yeah, how about that?
I may regret saying that later on.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I think everybody is getting updates on tariffs about every 20 minutes these days. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. It's interesting because you came in to Smith+Nephew with a charter of robotics and automation, and this is not uncommon. And yet there's this other reality here, which is that people have invested heavily in automation over the years, and that's good. I mean, there's a lot of great work to be done there, and I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit for automation has been realized. But what a lot of people don't realize is that, 70 to 80% of these problems that you actually see within operations are still caused by some sort of human root cause. And so for all of the focus on, on robotics and automation and vision, a lot of times the manual workflows, the humans on the shop floor that are doing this work are sometimes an afterthought. And this is, there's a lot of talk now of generative AI and the implications it has for the workforce. And I'm, by the way, fully agree. I think it's like a tremendous game-changing capability. And yet I have yet to talk with a single manufacturer out there who says, I have more than enough employees. Hiring is not my top problem. Retaining my workforce is no problem. And if we look at sort of zoomed out global statistics here, these statistics, the 70 to 80% of human defects, of failures being caused by human root cause. This is from the IHS Market, which is a sort of top tier data analytics platform owned by S&P. And sort of macro aggregate, most manufacturers are dealing with about 40% workforce turnover year over year. So that means that in 12 months from now, almost half of the team won't be there. And when you're talking about all of the low-hanging fruit for automation largely having been realized, what that means oftentimes is that the people who are left in these operations are being forced to do more highly varied, higher complexity tasks. And when you're battling turnover of about 40% annually, that can be a real challenge. So that's kind of macro high level, the world. Let's take a look specifically at some of the pressures that I see sort of broadly within medical device. I mean, this is obviously a highly regulated environment. I mean, if I look at Sarath, the products that you guys produce, these are life-altering and or life-saving products. So these are, need to be produced under very tight controls. And yet you also have to navigate the ability to think and work in an agile way, because as you pointed out, every 20 minutes, the world changes. With the tariff situation, which can inform where you're buying or what you're building, where things are being produced, what markets you're selling them to, et cetera, the workforce turnover. We also have a need in medical device from a regulatory perspective to have end-to-end traceability for all of the products that are being built. So it's insufficient to say, hey, this product is good, I've tested it. You actually need to show the full product genealogy of that product. And if you aren't thinking in a digital way, this can present some pretty profound challenges. In best case, massively inefficient. Worst case, it can be the kind of thing that stops production and stops the ability to distribute the product. We talked a little bit about the sort of the macro volatility from the perspective of tariffs, but supply chain instability has been a theme ever since, the world sort of optimized with just-in-time manufacturing, in a global liberal economic trade, lowering barriers to trade. COVID happened. You had the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal for a couple of months a few years ago. I don't know if we remember that. And now we're in this crazy tariff environment where who knows what tomorrow brings. And then, some of the workforce issues that we had that I mentioned before with, as you're bringing people into these very complex, very sensitive operations, we need to make sure that they're trained, that they have the right perspective, the right tools. And then all of this is happening within the context of an extremely complex IT infrastructure. So, you've got an IT system, you've got an ERP system, you've got a quality system, you've got, a SCADA system, you've got all of these different systems that need to talk to one another and that have data siloed within each of them that make sort of getting a holistic view of what's happening within the operation pretty difficult to get at. So that's kind of the macro environment. Sarath, I wonder if you have any comments on this are you experiencing some of these challenges?
Yeah, probably all of them. It resonates strongly. The one thing I note here, or a common theme that we've begun to talk about more, is agility. And I think that that's a word that, again, in other industries has been becoming more important long before now. I think in MedTech, med device, it's becoming, we're really realizing that being agile in our operations, being able to respond to change very quickly. When we thought about things like network changes in our factories or where to build a new operation, I'd say those problems have become multivariate, right? So originally, perhaps it was a discussion of labor rates or a discussion of tax or incentives within a geography. Now, to your point, the supply chain, our agility to make changes within the supply chain, the tariff situation require that very quickly we be able to understand what our situation is, project out scenarios, and make changes on the fly, right? Mm-hmm. We're not close to that yet, I'd imagine, and the nature of making those changes quickly becomes even more complex because we're making a regulated product, and so how we make it and how we label it is under significant regulation. So that just adds to the pain of trying to figure out, all right, if we need to make a change, how do we figure out what to do and how to execute it quickly? Yeah.
Well, and then, as if the tariff situation wasn't enough, you've got this thing. Has anybody heard about the new QMSR challenges? But basically the revised regulation around how quality systems are going to be implemented here. This was announced in January of 2024. There was 2 years, a 2-year period to transition, and we found this headline, and I don't know. I have a lot of conversations around this where a lot of folks are very concerned about the implications of this, because what it does specifically is basically increases the focus on quality, risk-based approach to quality, and it makes it almost, and from an audit perspective, no notice or very short notice audits. So between, notice that you're going to be audited and folks showing up on the door, we're talking about up to, down to 5 days or unannounced. So that's not terribly different. But if you don't have a digital means of capturing this information, it makes it extremely difficult to be able to show the kind of information you need to be able to comply with this. And it just places a much tighter set of regulations on, how operations are being run. And, I thought this headline was kind of interesting. It's like, when should we prepare? Should we wait? And the answer is absolutely not. This is like, you're going to be in a whole bunch of trouble if you don't have a good plan for how you're going to be compliant with this updated regulation. And we were doing a little bit of research. I thought this was kind of funny. What I didn't realize, CFR 21 has been around forever. It's gospel, but it actually was this new guidance is replacing guidance that was published 30 years ago. And if you think about what happened in the last 30 years, well, it just so happens that's when Google was founded. So like since CFR 21.820 was published, basically the internet happened, right? So it's like probably about time, if you ask me. I don't know, Sarath, if you have any thoughts on this.
No, I'm just thinking that you're making me feel old, because that's about when I entered. I started as a robotics engineer, but when I entered the med device world at Abbott was right around that time. So thanks so much for that. I'm as old as the internet.
You've got experience that you can share to help navigate challenges ahead. Perspective is forged from experience. And okay, so if we talk about like very specifically, what does this mean? Look, if you guys don't have if folks don't have a good plan for how you're going to be complying with this, and it puts a strong emphasis on digital infrastructure, digital data capture, and if there's not a plan in place for this, you run some pretty significant risks here from failed inspections, and there's all sorts of regulatory penalties. We talk about product delay. You can also be removed from a market. You can lose the ability to distribute a product in a market if you're not compliant with this. It standardizes with the ISO guidance here, so it's bringing it into harmonization with some of the regulation that's been in place in Europe, and then at the end of the day, it's prioritizing trust, safety, and quality of the end product that's being produced here. So I don't know, Sarath, maybe can you comment? Have you heard about this? Is this something that you're thinking about and concerned about?
The changes, yeah, I don't. It's interesting because we were talking about this before. We're less. To be frank, we're less concerned about that changeover, and in part, what we've been doing with Tulip and with our digitization initiatives is kind of exemplary of why, right? So a lot of the change is really just harmonization with ISO 13485, which has been around for a long time. Any multinational firm has already worked to harmonize with that as much as possible. There have been some early initiatives for device labeling and things like that have come into play. The things that kind of matter recently are, as you note, the increased risk from an audit perspective, because there's now exposure to internal audits and audits that you might have done privately, and so having a useful store of findings from what you did in those audits, figuring out how to trace what your corrective actions were, and being able to display those is becoming more important. I think most significantly is probably the risk-based approach to validation. And again, in general, from an R&D perspective, I think that most companies were thinking this way for a while, and you were seeing transitions, maybe less so on an operations side. I think for us, part of why this is less of a huge deal is when we were thinking about implementing the Tulip platform in our factories and really shifting to more GMP applications as opposed to just pure operational reporting. That really meant that we had to start thinking about verification and validation strategies, and Tulip had already thought through that. You've got the structures within your platform to allow easily showing changes, easy traceability, all of that stuff. But more importantly, I think you've spent a while, and your quality person Michelle is a big risk-based validation proponent, and so that really got a discussion that we were having already internally about risk-based validation and how to apply it. That just accelerated that, right? And in many ways, I've said within the company, if all we've done by bringing Tulip in and getting involved is just getting more modern with regard to risk-based validation, but specifically software risk-based validation and development procedures, then that's already transformative for us, let alone everything else we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I, it's interesting. I think you're one of the few people that I talk to that says, not such a big deal. But to be frank, you've been at the helm here for 6 years, and I think maybe I can toot your horn a little bit. I think you've really been, a lot of the things that have become sort of common knowledge or sort of convention over the last couple of years. I think, I remember when we started working together, this is 5-6 years ago, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think right after you came in.
About 6 years ago, yeah. Pre-pandemic, for sure. You guys were in a chocolate factory, as I recall.
That's right. It was early days. But I mean, you were on the forefront pushing this stuff. And I think you were ahead of the curve, and it was in a time when there wasn't like broad consensus that this is the way to go. And I think that the market has kind of come around and shown the wisdom of that perspective, of that initiative. But I would say the position that you're in now is you're ahead of the curve. Maybe I say it that way.
I'll take that to feel better, frankly, then, because sometimes there are good days and bad days, right? I will say, coming back to a large med device company after my time in startups and at Amazon, right? The environment's completely different. Med device is historically more conservative and has been slower to adopt technology. And I think in this instance too, it was really coming from the outside really helped, right? Because you could I remember saying early on to folks here, coming from Amazon, look, that the era of big monolithic software platforms is over, right? We're now looking at agile platforms in the cloud and composability and low code sort of platforms, and the sort of solutions that Tulip had were not surprising, I think, to me, but I think had been surprising in the industry at that point. So not surprised with where things have ended up here, but boy, it's been hard trying to convince people that that's what the world looks like when you're sitting on a different side of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, an outsider's perspective can be quite helpful in that regard. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, I want to kind of set the stage. We've got a couple more visuals here. And I have a one meme policy. Every webinar I'm a part of, I need at least one meme, which Megan loves, but accommodates. But let's talk a little bit about, I want to understand more around, what have you done? How have you implemented this? What are the learnings you've had? And to kind of set the stage here, this was, when we're thinking about the production process in a medical device manufacturing process environment where, you've got largely single piece flow, you're putting things together, there's like an assembly component to it. You need to validate, all of the subcomponents that are going into a build or into an end product. Then at the end of the line here, you need to review all of this to ensure that the product, you've got inline inspections to ensure that the product meets the quality requirements. Then at the end, you've got a validation package that you need to review to release the product and say, yes, this has been built appropriately. And this game that when I was a kid, I used to love to play Chutes and Ladders. I don't know, Sarath, that's, you probably played some Chutes and Ladders, back when it was fun.
In two ways, Chutes and Ladders, but of course my Indian relatives call it Snakes and Ladders. So I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen Snakes and Ladders too. But it's like you have to follow these processes, right? And you have to do these things. And it's like if everything goes great, you have opportunity to be much more efficient and kind of move up. So for example, if you're not relying on, pen and paper to capture all of the, process genealogy and history here, that saves you a ton of time. It's a ladder. And when you're getting ready to review, a batch or a set of products and release them to market, and you catch a documentation error, you hop on the chute and you're back down at square one, and you're going to spend a ton of time. And there's all sorts of opportunities for these efficiency gains and or anchors that you're going to put on the process here. You've got some examples here, but this idea of like, how can we systematically consolidate all of the I don't want to call them shortcuts, but let's call them like right first time best practices, and systematically implement these, so you aren't having to chase down all of these deviations or or documentation errors or things like that. So how do we free up in an environment in which there's not enough time and there's not enough people and things are changing often? How do we systematically improve this? And when we think a little bit about if you were to take these challenges and map them to a production environment, these are things from, things like production visibility or, inline process, inline quality checks, or, digital work instructions or process guidance. This is like performance visibility, all of, new employee training, for example. When we think about how all of these use cases come together, we sometimes refer to it as the platformification of frontline operations. And Sarath, you talked about it as, the world 6 years ago, you observed that the world had transitioned away from monolithic, rigid implementations of static software a long time ago, basically everywhere in the world except frontline operations and manufacturing. And I think when I think about all of these different use cases, they're all interconnected and interdependent in very important ways. If we were to take production visibility as an example, it's really hard to say where production visibility starts and like work or like an and-on application to indicate that the line is down and call for help, or a inline quality inspection, or digital work guidance, or product genealogy. Like, you can't separate these use cases, and in fact, all of them are important, and they all depend on information and overlap with these other use cases. And if you take this from a use case centric perspective, that's perhaps obvious, but when you extrapolate that out to different categories of software, like traditional MES or QMS or warehouse management systems, or lab execution systems, we have different categories of software to address these different things, and yet the boundaries between them can sometimes blur. Sarath, I wonder if you want to comment on sort of your experience as you take this mental model into operations within Smith+Nephew.
Yeah, there are a bunch of different ways to go from this, maybe, and you can kind of steer me if I'm going off into a tangent. But a few things come to mind here. One, just generally the idea that now the type of application, right, QMS, LES, logbooks, whatever, is really less important than the data and the model by which you have applications interface with the data, right? And I think other industries had figured that out earlier. We're sort of beginning to get there now. You see architectures changing to be able to manage that. And a simple example of that is, in a lot of cases, one of the things that I think that a Tulip engineer said to us early on that's really resonated and we keep repeating is, like, we know we've got problems when we walk in and see a bunch of different Excel spreadsheets all kind of covering the same rough areas, right? Because everyone has their own model of the data. And that's actually been something that it's not even particularly magical, but just placing all of the data that people are using across the factory in the same place and having everyone's work off of the same sheet has led to tremendous value. I think the other part here is that the interconnectivity of these use cases has been they were anyway. The ability to kind of go from one to the next has been super helpful in adoption within our organization as well, right? Particularly for a new platform technology like Tulip, because you're coming into, in a lot of cases, manufacturing processes that have been around for a while. A lot of these are, orthopedics manufacturing is cutting big chunks of metal, right? There's new stuff coming in with 3D printing and robotics, but making an E is making an E, right? And so you're dealing with relatively old school manufacturing practices and old school manufacturing knowledge, right? And part of the challenge of trying to implement some of these newer systems is just explaining what the art of the possible is and why increased data might be useful, right? We really made a mistake, I think, early on, in that we were so psyched by all of the stuff that the platform could do. Oh my gosh, look at this dashboard, and we're going to collect all this information and see, isn't that awesome? And we were really leading with the tech. we'd put up these dashboards and say, hey, wow, here's your utilization, and the site leaders would be like, yeah, I know that my utilization isn't great, so what do I do now? Right. A good example of that, I think, was in our Costa Rica facility. We were trying to get them to look into the platform, and we had found some folks in quality who were interested in scrap tracking, right? Like where is scrap coming from? How do we build? And really, it was just, if you will, adding up scrap by assemblies, by stations, right? So we wanted to make that change. I talked to the site leader. They had already invested years ago in another platform that really wasn't working for them. And I said, well, hey, we just want to play around with this. And he said, yeah, I'm not sure I want to spend the money. And so my deal with him was, all right, let me put in, I think it was 7 stations at the time, right? I said, let's put in the stations and try this little pilot out. We can't go live because it's a GMP level application. We just want to try understanding kind of how to track numbers. And if it doesn't work, it's on me. I'll pay for it. I'll pay for ripping it out. And so we built this application that allowed the operators. This is a very manual assembly process, right? People standing in an assembly line making things. This was for wound management. And so we allowed them, as something broke, they could just, enter something in front of them, say which piece it was it the entire sub-assembly, whatever. And then there was a live graph showing scrap generated at each station and the amount going up. So the app paid for itself in 3 days, right? And it paid for itself actually in kind of the niftiest way possible, which was a supervisor was on the line and saw that bar chart going up, right? And was like, well, what on earth is going on here, right? And went to the operator. That he called my OT lead at the site, and what makes it great is my OT lead did nothing, right? All he did was explain kind of what the content was of the graph they were seeing, right? So you had 2 supervisors and 2 operators sitting together, going, well, why could that possibly be? And as it turned out, we had a part that we sourced from a couple different places. And that all of that part was in range, but intriguingly, at the ends of the range, there was the slight change in diameter was enough to require more adhesive to pot the part, and so you saw failures upstream because there wasn't enough adhesive downstream. You never would have figured it out. They figured it out in like 20 minutes, and it was $150,000 annualized problem gone. Right. So I was able to go back and say, hey, look, so we've already paid for ourselves and we kind of just turned the thing on. So could we hang out for a while? Right. That was great thing number 1. But to the point here, the result of that was what I was actually hoping for the longest time, talking to my team, which was, look, we've been leading with the tech. We actually need to lead with the problem. And I'll know that we're making progress when our customers come back to us and say, well, that's stupid. I don't want that. Why don't you give me this? Right. Then we're actually having useful communications about, oh, great. Let's figure out what you need for that. And really speak in terms of not what we can give them for data, but what is the nature of their problem. Like I have why is my inventory so high, or why are scrap levels so high? So this same site leader came back to us and said, all right, the scrap thing's neat. We have a problem with delivery to promise for our finished goods, right? So like most MedTech manufacturers, we sterilize. We do a variety of sterilization techniques, including ETO sterilization, which is by batch, right? So you have a chamber of a certain size. Yep. You want to fill it ideally because you're paying the same amount of money no matter what. But his real issue was we'd have finished goods sitting in the warehouse waiting for sterilization runs. And simplest thing in the world, actually, we needed the paperwork for their paper DHRs and the paperwork for the sterilization orders. And all of that was kind of bouncing around the factory, getting signed by 50 million different people while the pallets of product were waiting. truck pulls up waiting to ship product out, and we can only ship the stuff where we have all of the paperwork together and the pallet together, and we know where it is, right? Well, we built a simple app, again, just for the simple request of, let's track those bundles of paper and match them to pallets on the floor, what's on the pallet, all of that great stuff. Just not to push anyone hard with data, just because, so it's a little silly. You're tracking paper, right? Which eventually will go away with EDHR. But what that allowed was this, okay, really quickly, hey, the truck's here. Let's make sure we have all the signatures, get this pallet on and kick it out. Wonderful. That improved time to promise. But even better, because we had instantiated all of that data, we allowed the people in the warehouse who were managing sterilization to say, hey, wait a minute, like, we only have a couple pallets going out for the sterilization run, and we have more room in the chamber. Of course, we have a bunch of different sterilization recipes for our products, depending on their size and packaging and the rest. It allowed them to say, well, do we have anything else sitting around that takes the same recipe that we can put into the chamber and take use of it? And so just give it, they could go, gave them the ability to go backwards up the chain, if you will, and say, hey, wait a minute, we've got 2 pallets sitting over here that we could just add to the order. Hurry it up, guys, get us the paperwork for that, and we can kick that out. And all of a sudden we saw utilization of our chambers pop from, in one case from the high 60s to about the 90% range, right? Which brings product costs down. We saw the amount of space in the warehouse that those pallets took up go down, I think, to 1/3 of what it was before, right? It was just sharing information and telling people where stuff was.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going on a bit, but there's more to this, if that helps. The neat thing was, to your linked model here, right? Okay, that solved that particular problem for the site leader. But now we had stations from the packaging area all the way to export. The next problem we had was solving something on the floor, right, in the clean room where we were manufacturing, and we were able to put a couple of stations there to solve, I can't even remember what it was, some kind of a work order app. Well, by slowly sort of expanding, so it was expanding with another one of those bubbles that you see on your chart there. By slowly sort of expanding, we actually had station coverage now pretty much from the beginning to the end of the operation, and could then add work order tracking, right? And then add dashboards to say, where is this order throughout the process, and then begin to track flow throughout the clean room, right? And figure out where there are inefficiencies. And we're just getting started with that. I'd say we just kind of completed the front to back coverage of that product line in February, right? So it's just beginning to kick out. But what's cool is we could, and we've done this in other sites as well, we can attack use cases that are real pain points for the specific site leader or the specific value stream leader. So we're solving a real problem, but we're doing it in the context of being able to expand and expand and expand. And my lead in Costa Rica refers to it as sort of a ripple model. We didn't even know, we did this thing and we didn't really understand that it actually opened up this, and this, which were problems we didn't know existed, right? And someone else could see it and say, oh, I have this problem. Can't you just expand a little bit to give me this, right? And so the interconnectedness of those use cases has actually helped us to stepwise justify each application we're doing while building up those huge capabilities that the old monolithic systems professed to deliver. Sorry, long story. I hope
it's great. It's like, that's why we're all here. This is fantastic. But it's what you're describing is like the very concept of it's like, why composability and why, I mean, if you're R&D and you come from, kind of an outsider perspective to operations, but this is like software transitioned to a microservices architecture 30 years ago for a reason, right? Mm-hmm. And it's basically the same principles applied in the context of operations. And the irony here is that, when we think about Agile and we think about, lean like Agile is just like software engineers took lean and applied it to software development. And then they like kept going. And now we're like, if I look at operations, we're like, oh, hey, what's this agile thing they're doing? And it's like, it's what you've been doing all along. It's the same thing.
It is fascinating how much like the domains are crossing here now, right? And I do have a lot of moments where I'm like, well, we were doing this in R&D a while ago, but okay, part of it is just the nature of the different disciplines, right? And how that changes. But again, if all we had done by doing this was bring in risk-based software development and validation and agile Scrum methodologies into the operational world, then great. That's for us. That's already a step change, right?
Well, you've got I don't know, 3-day payback. That's what that's like 10,000% ROI if my math quick. I don't know. Like I think that math maybe checks. 300 working days in a month, 3-day payback. That's 100x. Add 2 zeros, right? 10,000%.
Yeah. We tell that story all the time, and it's weird. Every time we do something, we see. I guess it oughtn't to be weird. We were just talking about this a couple of weeks ago. We implemented an EDHR pilot, right, and saw scrap go down, right. And we were like,
yeah.
How on earth? So almost everything we do, we're seeing scrap go down, which is strange. Yeah. You would think up front, but of course it's not. What happens is a lot of the scrap is because of documentation errors or whatever that cause product to spin. Even the product's fine from a quality perspective. It's that someone entered in something wrong or someone's checking a paper DHR or whatever, and eventually
what I typically see is I can't speak to Smith+Nephew specifically, but it would not be atypical to see 90%, 80 to 90% of deviations be a result of some sort of manual entry error here. So, I mean, I don't know what your experience is.
Without giving too much away, I would say, you would expect that MedTech manufacturers, med device manufacturers, whatever, are making good quality product, right? Because people's lives depend on it. You would know pretty quickly if something fundamentally wrong was going on with the product. So it's unsurprising that NCRs and non-conformances and deviations and things like that are more likely because of something that isn't fundamental to the product or manufacturing process, but to the documentation, right? Someone wrote something wrong in the wrong place. Someone forgot to check something, whatever, right? The product's nominally still good, but you're either spending a huge amount of time dealing with the documentation part of it or a huge amount of time going back and reprocessing, right? So just implementing EDHR on the one line we saw, I mean, again, without giving away a lot, I will say on that one pilot line, which we've been running thus far over the past, July? 5 months, we have had zero documentation nonconformances. And that depends. How many did you have before is a fascinating question. And the before is a lot, right? The number.
Well, it sounds almost too good to be true. But if you think about it, it's like, how could you have a documentation error if you have a system that forces you to enter the correct documentation before you can take the next step,
Yeah, I actually got spoken to at that because my boss is like, that's amazing. And my response was like, well, it's kind of what we were trying to do, right? Like, I don't know what to tell you.
And then the next thing is like, well, why did you take so long? Right. Look, I want to be mindful of time. I had a bunch of questions lined up that we were going to go into, but to be honest, I think we sort of navigated and asked all the major questions that I wanted to cover today. So if I could ask you quickly, look, you're 6 years into this journey, and I think you're much further ahead of the curve than a lot of folks in this industry that I talk to. And I'd just be curious, what advice do you have if you were to go back and do it again, or if you were to start this fresh at another operation? What advice do you have for somebody who's just getting started on this journey, or who's thinking about taking this step, or perhaps they see the change in regulation and they're not prepared for it, and they understand the implications, and this is a call to become digital first, and yet they don't have the support of the organization or the strategy in place to be able to execute this?
Probably two things come to mind. I think the idea of leading with the problem and not the tech is important, and I think that from an OT perspective, we kind of start with the tech because that's what we're engineers working with solutions, right? I think it's really critical. And I think one of the one of the real values of this platform is designed not to be, a funky software platform. It's designed to be a frontline operations platform. And you can think first from an operations perspective, right? And so if you're thinking about problems to solve, not in terms of what data you need, but in terms of what is the fundamental business problem you're trying to solve, and then begin to blow into that. All right, what do I actually need to know that would actually make it easier for us to solve that problem, right? There's nothing, there are ways people were solving these problems before, just maybe not efficiently or whatever. How can I speed that up? We're just a tool. We elevate. Our goal is to elevate our coworkers, right? Probably the big learning for me was getting quality involved early, right? And so we've really moved to, people talk a lot about the IT/OT convergence, right? And there being some tension between IT and OT as manufacturing 4.0 expands. I think for MedTech, quality is a critical third partner. And by shifting to a governance scheme where we had myself for operations, quality, and IT all kind of working together for the factory floor, we're all interested in solving the problems and interested in trying to do that efficiently. By pulling quality in, it actually created the ability for those of us who were driving tech in those three departments to speak with a unified voice and say, all right, here's how we're going to lay this stuff out, and here's the value it's going to bring to the organization. I should have done that way earlier than I did.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. A couple of takeaways here, and then I think we're going to move over to some Q&A. But when we were preparing for this, I think this, if we think about the key takeaways that I'm taking away from the conversation from today, it's, if I could summarize them, and feel free to jump in. But first, you talk about taking a or a business case first approach, a problem first approach, as opposed to a technology first approach. And I remember 6 years ago we started working together, and I remember one of your engineers, Dan Meyer, was I saw this video of all of the machines connected at this facility, and it was showing real-time utilization across all of these different assets. And I was looking at a video of a laptop screen, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And this is at a time when the industry was still like, I don't know if cloud is ready for manufacturing, I don't know if real time is a realistic goal. And it the camera panned out just to the left, and it was out an airplane window at 45,000 feet or 30,000 feet in the air. And I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. Now, today we might not be so impressed with that, but that was an example probably of really cool tech at the time. But again, did it really prioritize the business problem first? Maybe not. And then the second is, you talked about this composability approach, and you're like, I don't know, somebody's going to do the math and call me out in comments here, but my back of the envelope math is 10,000% ROI, 3-day payback as a land to then continue to build out this digital thread, solving problems and creating value every step along the way. And then you have this infrastructure, this digital fabric that you can use to become a much more agile team. And that, in an age of macro volatility where tariffs are changing every 20 minutes and you've got new regulation coming out here, is that's not a nice to have. You need that. And then the last is the building digital champions in partnership with the local teams in the relationships between ops, IT, and quality to be able to support where the work is being done are the kind of three takeaways that I took.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, so I'm glad the story has covered some of that. I think that the champions part is also really critical, right? Being able to solve those problems on the ground that are tactical, small. First, my teams in the sites have just been persistent, right? Yeah, there's just valiant is the word we use. They just keep pushing on a rope, keep trying to solve problems and show people the value. I'm just in awe of them doing that. But a big chunk of that is also pulling in the operators and the supervisors on the ground. They're the ones who are actually living the problems, not those of us sitting up in fancy office suites. And their joy and their value at seeing those things work is actually much more useful to us than complex strategies.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so with that, let's turn it over for questions.
So to start out, we have, talking about this problem first mindset at Smith+Nephew, how do you identify the initial pain points that led to significant breakthroughs like the Costa Rica scrap app?
So now we do it by, we're getting a little bit more formal about having my teams or myself sit in at the strategic levels, either for the business unit or for the site, right? And I think we're slowly approaching the state where site leaders are understanding that having OT, if not on their site leadership team, at least, hearing what the site leadership team is discussing and what the issues are is ending up being worth it. Because they're talking about business problems and we're thinking tools, and we can say, well, hey, wait a minute, we could make that, some of these things are easy, and just people don't realize they're easy. A lot of it was just shifting from doing stuff that we thought was cool to asking people what their huge issues were, and just volunteering. Hey, we'll do what you want, right? We're a service organization. You're a customer. Tell us what you want. We'll try and help with it.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I think honestly it comes down to real impact for people who are on the front lines. And kind of in that same vein, what were some key strategies you employed to get people to like foster this adoption of this mindset, especially across quality and IT?
Yeah. So we spent a while before we kind of touched the third rail of GMP, right? We just looking at generating operational data, and there, as I noted, while initial deployments really required some support from leadership, right? As you're doing the work, it's really working directly hand in hand with the operators, and I think probably the supervisors on the floor are probably our best allies, right? Because that's really where the rubber meets the road. They have numbers they have to hit that day. Their performance is looked at every single moment. They're not thinking about grand strategies. They're thinking about how did I do today? Where are my pain points? So the ability to make changes quickly, to understand what their real needs were quickly, that really got us a lot of value. And then we could use that to show up the chain. Hey, look, we've solved this problem, and we can begin to expand out and solve others. I know we don't have time for stories. I'll tell a really quick one anyway, because as you can tell, I like stories. In one case 4 years ago, I want to say, we were doing a machine monitoring uptime application for one of our ortho sites. I went to the building leader and said, hey, how's this going? We have this thing, you can see what your utilization is and all that. And he said, that's really not my problem. My problem is I don't have enough supervisors. And I said, well, why do you need that? He said, well, because I only have 2 and we're spread out over 3 buildings, and, this utilization is great, but if a cell goes down, I don't know, and they don't know, they have to walk around and check, right? Even if there's a dashboard or something, they're busy working in cells. And I said, well, would it be helpful if we sent you a Teams message if it said cell was idle, or if we called you or paged you or whatever? And he's like, yeah, how long would it take you to do that? Did it in a day, because that's the nature of the platform, right? So it was just again, that I don't like this, why don't you give me that? Right? Great. Mm-hmm. That was useful feedback. And then by being able to respond and solve that problem immediately, bang, you got a friend for life, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And so I think as we look at the FDA regulations, we're concerned about documentation auditing. So a question we have here is, can you give a bit more detail about how you approached implementation for EDHR and EVR solutions?
Yeah, carefully, right? What we did was we started with a pilot, and did that on a line where we had already done a lot of connectivity just for operations purposes, right? So we had done the connectivity to do machine monitoring and a little bit of process control, which operator is on it, all that sort of great stuff. So we had a lot of the infrastructure in place to connect EDHR anyway. And then that gave us a little bit of security to say, fine, we can begin now talking to the process and pulling in the quality people and the OpEx people to really map out, all right, what does this actual process look like now that we have some data around it just from the operational part, and how would we translate that for, because again, you can't just go in and do EDHR on a process as it exists. Quite often, you actually need to make process changes in order to facilitate laying out the data acquisition properly. So we did that. We kind of told ourselves, here's what we would expect if this application worked well. And I think just as importantly, we said, fine, for this MVP, right, the minimum viable product, here's what we're not going to do, right? Just to get started, we're going to aggregate data. We want this to be a live EDHR component, so it's going to be verified, validated, all the rest. But we're going to have clean walls where we're still going to have paper, and that's okay, right? Because we're just going to do this bit. And in this case, it happened to be integrations, right, with SAP and the rest. But that was enough. It really showed, okay, for the areas where we have full EDHR, we're not seeing documentation nonconformances, we're seeing improvements in scrap rate, all of the rest. And as importantly, again, I'm able to show people, there was this discussion about like, well, gee, we can't figure out why these measurements aren't working or whatever. And we could say, hey, look, we have live measurement data now. Like, didn't you know we were getting you that? EDHR gets you that automatically, right? And so it's opened up that ripple effect again. It's opened up all of these other application areas that are going to be far more valuable than EDHR in and of itself, right? So,
and if I could just add to that, I think like one of the critical things that you said is you defined the things that you're not going to do, and you were disciplined about not doing those things. Because one of the mistakes that I see time and time again is, folks take it and they say, hey, we're going to solve this problem. And then they say, oh, but we can do this and we can do that and we can do this and we can do that. And before you know it, you get so wrapped around the axle doing all these cool things that you almost lose sight of the problem that you were there to solve. And it's one of the key dangers that I see time and time again. So staying disciplined on, this is what we're going to do. We're going to prove it. We're going to stay disciplined and not go beyond this until we prove this one MVP is the key. Sarath, thank you so much for joining us today.
Fascinating for the platform.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the partnership. It's been a fun journey, and I know we're just getting started. There's still a whole lot of work to do. So thank you for that, and thank you for your time today.
Awesome. See y'all. Thanks all for tuning in.